September 15, 1940, and Dr. Heinrich Müller stood amid the smoking ruins of a residential block in East London, his instruments detecting electromagnetic signatures that should not exist. The Luftwaffe had assured Berlin that British air defences relied on primitive detection methods, easily overwhelmed by superior numbers and tactics. They were catastrophically wrong. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What Müller and his team would discover in the rubble of London over the following months would shatter every assumption the German military leadership held about British technological capability, transforming confident predictions of swift victory into a desperate race to understand an innovation they had fatally underestimated. Dr. Heinrich Müller had spent 18 years studying electromagnetic propagation at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin before the conflict began. His credentials were impeccable: 3 published papers on radio wave behavior, 2 patents on signal amplification, and the respect of colleagues across Europe. When the German Air Ministry requested his expertise in analyzing British air defense capabilities in early 1940, he accepted with the quiet confidence of a man who believed he understood the fundamental limits of radio detection technology. His assignment seemed straightforward: accompany forward intelligence units during aerial operations over Britain, collect technical data on British countermeasures, and provide assessments to help refine tactics. The prevailing theory in Berlin suggested that the British were using a network of ground-based listening posts, essentially sophisticated acoustic detection systems that could hear approaching aircraft engines from significant distances. Some analysts speculated about rudimentary radio direction finding, but nothing that couldn't be countered with careful route planning and radio silence protocols. Müller's first shock came not from what he measured, but from what he witnessed. On the night of September 7, 1940, he observed from a forward position as 247 bombers approached London along what intelligence had assured was an unmonitored corridor. British fighters appeared exactly where they needed to be, climbing to intercept altitude with a precision that acoustic detection could never provide. The timing was too perfect, the positioning too exact. He recorded in his field journal that evening: observed defensive response inconsistent with acoustic or visual detection methods. British fighters achieved optimal intercept geometry despite cloud cover and darkness. Probability of chance encounter negligible. Unknown detection method suspected. Lieutenant Franz Weber, a Luftwaffe intelligence officer assigned to work with Müller, initially dismissed the scientist's concerns. Weber had flown 23 missions over Britain and believed he understood the tactical situation perfectly. "They're simply getting lucky," Weber insisted during their first heated discussion. "Or they have spotters we haven't identified yet. There's no magical technology making our aircraft visible in the dark." But Müller was not a man who believed in luck, especially not luck that occurred with statistical consistency. Over the next 6 weeks, he compiled data from 41 separate operations. British fighters achieved effective intercept positions in 38 of those missions. The correlation between British defensive success and specific approach routes became impossible to ignore. Something was detecting incoming aircraft at ranges far beyond visual or acoustic capability, and that something was providing precise location information to British controllers. In late October, Müller's investigation took a decisive turn. German forces had captured an intact British radar installation near Dover, a tall steel tower surrounded by mysterious antenna arrays and a concrete bunker containing equipment unlike anything he had seen before. The installation had been abandoned hastily when German troops advanced, leaving behind a treasure trove of technical documentation and partially destroyed equipment. Müller spent 3 days examining the site with a team of technicians. What he found there challenged everything he thought he knew about radio detection limits. The British had developed a system that transmitted powerful pulses of radio energy at very high frequencies, then detected the infinitesimally small echoes bouncing back from metal aircraft surfaces. The precision of the timing circuits, the sophistication of the display technology, the clever solutions to noise filtering. It represented a leap forward in practical engineering that German efforts had not achieved. The transmitter used magnetron tubes capable of producing peak power outputs exceeding 10,000 watts at wavelengths around 1.5 meters. The receiver employed multiple stages of amplification with automatic gain control, feeding into cathode ray tube displays that presented range and bearing information simultaneously. Most impressively, the system included integrated communications links that allowed multiple stations to coordinate observations, creating overlapping coverage zones that made penetration without detection nearly impossible. Müller drafted an urgent technical report for Berlin, detailing his findings with careful precision. He emphasized that the British system, they called it radio detection and ranging, or radar, represented not merely an incremental improvement in existing technology, but a fundamental transformation in air defense capability. He calculated that the coverage provided by the British radar network gave defenders approximately 15 to 20 minutes of warning before bombers reached their targets, time enough to scramble fighters, position them advantageously and vector them toward incoming threats with remarkable accuracy. The response from Berlin disappointed him. Senior military officials found his conclusions difficult to accept. How could the British, who had been so thoroughly unprepared for conflict in 1939, suddenly possess technological advantages over German research institutions? Several prominent scientists questioned Müller's methodology, suggesting he had overestimated British capabilities based on limited evidence. Some implied he was making excuses for Luftwaffe tactical failures. Colonel Ernst Richter, representing the Air Ministry, was particularly dismissive during a conference in Berlin in early November. "Dr. Müller, you're suggesting that we've been fundamentally wrong about British technical capacity," Richter said, his tone conveying polite skepticism. "That seems unlikely given our intelligence assessments and the demonstrated superiority of German engineering in virtually every other domain." Müller responded with the patient frustration of a scientist addressing someone who refused to examine evidence. "Colonel, I'm not suggesting anything. I'm reporting what I observed and measured. The British radar network exists, it functions effectively, and it's the primary reason our losses have exceeded predictions. Dismissing this information because it contradicts our assumptions is strategically dangerous." The meeting concluded without any significant change in operational planning. Müller returned to his analysis, increasingly convinced that institutional pride was preventing rational assessment of British capabilities. Meanwhile, in Britain, the reality of radar's impact was becoming clear to everyone involved in air defense operations. Squadron leader James Blackwood had flown Spitfires since the conflict began, and he remembered the chaos of early operations before radar coverage became comprehensive. "We used to patrol randomly, hoping to stumble across bombers," he recalled in a letter to his sister in December 1940. "Now we scramble with specific vectors, distance, altitude, heading. We know exactly where they are before we can even see them. It's changed everything." The technical sophistication that impressed Müller had emerged from years of focused development by British scientists working under intense pressure. Robert Watson Watt, the physicist who pioneered the British radar program, had submitted his initial proposals in 1935, a full 5 years before the intense aerial campaigns over Britain. By 1939, Britain had constructed a chain of 20 stations along the eastern and southern coasts, each capable of detecting aircraft at ranges exceeding 100 miles. This head start in practical deployment gave Britain an advantage that German forces struggled to counter. Even after Müller's detailed reports confirmed radar's existence and effectiveness, German scientific and industrial resources were already committed to other priorities. Developing a comparable system from scratch would require years of focused effort and resources that were increasingly constrained. Müller continued his investigation throughout the winter of 1940 and into 1941. He analyzed captured British technical manuals, interviewed personnel who had operated radar stations, and conducted careful measurements of electromagnetic emissions from active British installations. Each layer of analysis revealed new dimensions of British technical sophistication. One particularly revealing discovery came in March 1941. When Müller examined damaged components recovered from a British night fighter that had been forced down relatively intact. The aircraft carried its own compact radar system, an airborne interception set that allowed the fighter to detect and track enemy bombers independently, after ground controllers provided initial vectors. The miniaturization required to fit a functional radar system into an aircraft represented another leap in engineering sophistication. They've solved the power supply problem, the antenna miniaturization problem, and the vibration isolation problem simultaneously, Miller wrote in his technical assessment. Each of these challenges would occupy a research team for months. The British have integrated solutions into an operational system that's already flying combat missions. Our assumptions about British technical capability were not merely wrong, they were dangerously naive. By mid-1941, German forces had captured enough British radar equipment and documentation to attempt their own versions. But recreating technology and deploying it operationally proved to be vastly different challenges. German radar development, which had been progressing slowly before the conflict, now accelerated under the pressure of strategic necessity. But Britain's 5-year head start in practical deployment created advantages that could not be quickly overcome. Müller found himself in the paradoxical position of being proven correct while remaining professionally marginalized. His early warnings had been dismissed, and although subsequent evidence had vindicated his analysis, those who had rejected his findings were reluctant to acknowledge their error. Instead, he was quietly reassigned to defensive radar development, working on systems to protect German cities from the growing threat of British bombing operations. The irony was not lost on him. He spent the remainder of 1941 and much of 1942 helping to create German radar networks based largely on principles learned from captured British equipment. The student had become the teacher, and the lesson was a bitter one about the cost of technological complacency. Fighter pilot Lieutenant Joseph Kessler experienced the transition from the operational side. He had flown missions over Britain during the intense campaigns of 1940, when British fighters seemed to appear from nowhere with unsettling regularity. By 1942, he was defending German cities using radar-guided intercept techniques, virtually identical to those the British had employed against him 2 years earlier. "It's remarkable how quickly everything changed," Kessler wrote in his diary in August 1942. "We spent months wondering how they always knew we were coming. Now we have the same capability, and I understand why we couldn't penetrate their defenses. You can't hide from these systems. Every aircraft becomes visible, regardless of weather or darkness or clever navigation. The advantage goes entirely to the defender." The broader implications of radar's development extended far beyond tactical air defense. The technology represented a fundamental shift in military capability that affected naval operations, artillery targeting, and strategic bombing campaigns. Moreover, the institutional failures that prevented German leadership from taking Müller's early warnings seriously offered a case study in how organizational pride and confirmation bias can lead to strategic miscalculation. Captain William Richardson, a British radar operator at a coastal station, recorded his perspective on the technology's impact in a memoir written after the conflict ended. "We could see them coming from 100 miles away, sometimes more. Every aircraft, every formation, tracked continuously from the moment they crossed the coast until they left our coverage area. The information went directly to fighter control, and they scrambled squadrons with precision timing. The Germans never understood why their carefully planned operations kept running into fighters at exactly the wrong moment. We had an invisible advantage that changed the fundamental mathematics of air defense." Richardson's account aligned precisely with Müller's technical analysis. The 15 to 20 minutes of warning time that radar provided was sufficient to transform air defense from reactive scrambling to coordinated interception. British fighters could climb to optimal altitude, position themselves advantageously, and engage with tactical initiative. The psychological impact on bomber crews was significant. They never knew when or where fighters would appear, creating constant tension that affected combat effectiveness. By 1943, both sides possessed operational radar systems, and the technological competition had shifted to electronic countermeasures and counter-countermeasures. But Britain's early lead had provided crucial advantages, during the most desperate phases of the conflict. The time purchased by effective air defense allowed British industry to accelerate production, American support to arrive in increasing quantities, and defensive preparations to reach maturity. Müller continued his work on German radar systems through 1944, contributing to incremental improvements in detection range, resolution, and reliability. But his enthusiasm had been tempered by the realization that technical excellence meant little without the institutional willingness to act on accurate information. He had provided clear, evidence-based warnings about British capabilities in late 1940, and those warnings had been dismissed because they contradicted prevailing assumptions. In his private correspondence with colleagues who had remained at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, Müller reflected on the broader lessons of his experience. "Science requires humility," he wrote in December 1944. "We must be willing to revise our understanding when evidence contradicts our theories." Military institutions are particularly vulnerable to confirmation bias because acknowledging error can seem like admitting weakness. But ignoring inconvenient truths doesn't make them disappear. It merely postpones the inevitable reckoning until the cost becomes unbearable. The final year of the conflict in Europe saw German radar technology deployed extensively in defensive roles, attempting to counter the overwhelming numbers of Allied aircraft conducting strategic bombing operations. The systems worked reasonably well within their technical limitations, but they could not compensate for the fundamental imbalance in industrial capacity and available resources. Radar had made air defense more effective, but it could not overcome disadvantages in production, logistics, and numerical superiority. When the conflict ended in May 1945, Müller found himself detained by British intelligence officers interested in his technical expertise. They interviewed him extensively about German radar development, sharing some details of British programs in exchange for his cooperation. One British scientist, a colleague of Watson Watt, who had worked on the original radar development, met with Müller for a lengthy technical discussion in July 1945. "We knew German scientists were capable of developing similar systems," the British researcher explained. "What surprised us was how long it took for your military leadership to recognize what we had deployed. We expected countermeasures much sooner. The fact that you were still debating whether our radar network existed in late 1940 gave us crucial time to refine our tactics and expand our coverage." Müller nodded, appreciating the frank assessment. "We had the technical capability," he acknowledged. "What we lacked was the institutional willingness to challenge our own assumptions." I provided detailed reports in October 1940 based on captured equipment and operational observations. Those reports were questioned by people who had never examined the evidence themselves. By the time the reality became undeniable, you had a 5-year lead in operational deployment that we could never overcome. The British scientists smiled with a mixture of sympathy and satisfaction. Science advances through questioning assumptions and testing hypotheses against evidence. Military institutions sometimes struggle with that approach because it requires admitting uncertainty. "Your technical analysis was excellent. I reviewed your captured reports. Your leadership simply wasn't ready to hear what you were telling them." After his release, Müller returned to academic research, working on civilian applications of radar technology for weather forecasting and air traffic control. He published several papers on the lessons learned from operational radar deployment during the conflict, emphasizing the importance of integrated systems thinking and the dangers of institutional confirmation bias. In a 1952 lecture at the Technical University of Berlin, Müller reflected on his wartime experience with the perspective of hindsight. The British radar network represented a triumph, not merely of technical innovation, but of institutional commitment and strategic vision. They identified a critical capability gap in the early 1930s and devoted substantial resources to solving it, despite skepticism from many quarters. By the time the conflict began, they had deployed a working system that provided immediate operational advantages. He paused, adjusting his notes before continuing. "On our side, we had capable scientists and engineers. We had research institutions with strong traditions. What we lacked was the organizational flexibility to recognize and respond to evidence that contradicted our preconceptions. When I reported that the British possessed a sophisticated radar network in October 1940, I was providing information that military planners desperately needed. But because that information challenged existing assumptions about British technical inferiority, it was questioned rather than investigated. Muller's lecture emphasized a theme that would become increasingly relevant in the decades that followed: the importance of intellectual humility and evidence-based decision-making in technical and strategic planning. Organizations that could quickly adapt to new information and revised understanding held significant advantages over those constrained by institutional pride and rigid thinking. Former squadron leader Blackwood, who attended a conference where Muller presented his research in 1954, recalled their conversation afterward. Dr. Muller told me that the hardest part of his wartime experience was not the technical challenges but the institutional resistance to uncomfortable truths. He had identified the source of our defensive success within weeks of serious investigation, but spent more than a year trying to convince his superiors that his findings were accurate. That delay cost his side dearly, but it gave us time to perfect our tactics and expand our coverage. The technical legacy of radar development during the 1940s extended far beyond military applications. Weather forecasting, air traffic control, maritime navigation, and eventually space exploration all benefited from the forced acceleration of radar technology driven by wartime necessity. The competitive pressure created by the conflict compressed decades of potential development into a few intense years of focused effort. But the institutional lessons proved equally significant. The British success with radar demonstrated the value of long-term strategic investment in emerging technologies, even when immediate applications were uncertain. The German experience illustrated the dangers of dismissing evidence because it contradicted established beliefs. Both lessons remained relevant in subsequent decades as technological change accelerated and the consequences of strategic miscalculation grew more severe. Muller remained professionally active until his retirement in 1968, contributing to various scientific advisory committees and continuing to publish research on electromagnetic propagation and radar technology. His wartime reports, which had been captured by Allied forces and later declassified, became valuable historical documents for scholars studying the intersection of science, technology, and military decision-making. In his final published paper, written shortly before his death in 1973, Muller returned to the theme that had defined his career. The scientific method requires us to follow evidence wherever it leads, regardless of whether the destination aligns with our preferences or expectations. Institutional structures that punish or dismiss inconvenient findings create dangerous blind spots that can persist until reality forces correction through painful experience. The history of radar development during the 1940s provides a clear example of both successful strategic vision and costly institutional failure. We would do well to remember both lessons. The story of what German scientists said when they tested the Rubble of London and found radar they couldn't explain became a case study in technical intelligence, institutional learning, and the importance of intellectual flexibility. Muller's careful documentation of British radar capabilities in late 1940 provided accurate information that could have influenced German tactical and strategic planning. The decision to question rather than investigate that information delayed recognition of British advantages until those advantages had become nearly insurmountable. Decades after the conflict ended, historians examining declassified documents could trace the evolution of understanding on both sides. British scientists and military planners who had gambled on radar development in the mid-1930s saw their investment validated by operational success during the intense campaigns of 1940 and 1941. German scientists like Muller, who had quickly recognized what the British had achieved, watched with frustration as institutional inertia prevented rapid response to clear technical intelligence. The electromagnetic signatures that Muller detected in the Rubble of London in September 1940 told a story that many in Berlin were not ready to hear. A story about British technical sophistication, strategic foresight, and operational capability that contradicted comfortable assumptions about inherent German superiority. The months and years that followed would prove the accuracy of Müller's analysis and demonstrate the cost of dismissing evidence that challenged established beliefs. For the pilots, operators, and civilians whose lives were affected by radar technology, the abstract questions of technical development and institutional learning had immediate, tangible consequences. British fighter pilots gained crucial advantages that improved their survival rates and effectiveness. German bomber crews faced increasingly difficult operational conditions as defensive capabilities improved. Civilian populations on both sides experienced the ongoing evolution of aerial warfare, shaped by technological innovation and tactical adaptation. The wider lessons extended beyond the specific circumstances of radar development. In any field where technical capability affects strategic outcomes, the ability to accurately assess relative strengths and weaknesses becomes crucial. Organizations that can overcome confirmation bias, investigate uncomfortable findings, and adapt quickly to new information hold advantages over those constrained by institutional pride and rigid thinking. The price of ignoring or dismissing accurate intelligence can be measured in lost opportunities, wasted resources, and preventable failures. Müller's story also illustrated the complex position of scientists working within military institutions during conflict. His technical expertise allowed him to recognize British radar capabilities months before that recognition became widespread in German military circles. But his lack of institutional authority and the resistance he encountered from senior officers limited his ability to influence decision-making. The tension between technical expertise and organizational hierarchy created delays that had strategic consequences. In the end, both sides developed effective radar systems, and the technology became a standard component of military capability that has remained essential through subsequent decades. But the timing and circumstances of that development revealed important differences in institutional approach, strategic vision, and the ability to learn from evidence. Britain's early investment and rapid deployment created advantages during a critical period. Germany's delayed recognition and reactive development illustrated the costs of complacency and confirmation bias. The Rubble of London, where Müller first measured unexplained electromagnetic signatures in September 1940, has long since been cleared and rebuilt. The radar towers that ringed Britain during the conflict have mostly been demolished or repurposed. The scientists, pilots, and operators who experienced the transformation wrought by this technology have passed on. But the lessons they learned about innovation, institutional learning, and the importance of following evidence wherever it leads remain relevant and instructive. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.